I think at Labour conference she essentially like launched her mayoral campaign. But she's like Corbynite. She's a proper socialist.
Yeah, there's plenty of wealth to be attacked.
Yeah.
It's so depressing. It is. I mean, the right wing. And the first thing I think reform will beat to we just hold our nerve here.
Yeah, I hope so.
Maybe I'm being wishful thinking. But I think when people see them trying to run councils and they're fighting like cats in a bag and chaos.
I think there's an aspect of that, but then I think that some things just become a kind of self-perpetuating prophecy. Like, everyone I speak to in the shadow cabinet is very frustrated just by the media narrative, because reform now get way...
There we go.
Right.
Great speech earlier.
That means we can get started.
Your Mabel.
Oh, you watched it?
I was there.
That was very kind.
I joined the panel as well.
Yeah.
You warmed up nicely.
So I'm going to start with an open question. What one thing do businesses want to see? Do you want to go first, or would you rather go back and sort of wrap up after?
I hope they're not filming us both up.
First
to be good.
Prerogative. It's not stolen.
One thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello. How are you? Good. Nice to see you. Good to see you. Yeah.
Right, now we have a full panel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for joining us. There we go. Thank you very much for joining us. If this is your first time in the CPS Gallery, welcome. If it's not, welcome back. My name's Emma Revel. I'm the External Affairs Director here at the Centre for Policy Studies, and I'm delighted to be chairing this panel in partnership with the Jobs Foundation, which is getting Britain working. How can businesses... I've had my post-conference cold start early, so apologies. Hopefully my voice will last the next hour. I will do the best that I can. Delighted to be chairing this panel in partnership with the Jobs Foundation, Getting Britain Working. If I start on the far side, my panellists are Andrew Allam, who is a corporate advisor with 30 years of experience. Delighted to be joined by Alice Denby, the opinion and features editor at City AM and a former colleague of mine at CapEx. The Shadow Secretary of State for Business and Trade, Andrew Griffith, and Matthew Elliott, who is President of the Jobs Foundation. Now, I'm going to start with an opening question, which is, what one thing do the panel think that businesses want to see from government? And I'm going to use Shadow Cabinet privilege and allow Andrew to go first.
What one thing? I mean, look, I'm going to link them all. I'll try and be clever before I get flushed out. Look, the thing that business want more than anything is confidence. Because if you're in business, you're taking risks. It's a challenge. Whether you hire somebody, whether you sign a new lease on a building, you worry about the next product you're trying to put in market. It's hard, right? Business is hard. It's a wonderful, wonderful exercise in human enterprise, but it's hard. And so it's doubly, triply hard if you're doing that against a backdrop that you simply can't be confident. You can't, for example, be confident because your Chancellor's chosen the longest possible for the second year in a row lead into a budget, and you simply don't know what the incentives environment, what the tax, how your consumers are going to feel, whether they're individual consumers or other businesses. So I think you have to say, from my own business experience, it's about confidence. If I can just unpack that a tiny bit, what are the elements of confidence? Well, you sort of want to, ideally, you'll have your own vision, but you want to understand how that vision sits into the vision for the country or the markets in which you operate. What are the big strides, what are the big plays in terms of technology? Where's that country going to be? Where is it going? And so you want your political leadership of whatever party they are to have a vision. Secondly, you want the confidence of knowing that you're valued, that exercise itself is something of value in society, that all of our body language, the values that we embed in legislation and incentives and a tax system, those values are shared and people really want you to succeed. I'll stop here, but one of my big points on the theme of my platform speech here today was creating a new generation of entrepreneurs and backing business. Now, if we can do those are essentially an exercise in culture. Right? I can line up lots of individual little measures about wouldn't it be better if the tax system was simpler, if we could open bank accounts without people treating as criminals. But at the end of the day, this is a cultural point about us celebrating people who take risk and people who create wealth. And I think that's one of our biggest advantages, but one of the biggest challenges now of a society in which wealth creators don't feel that the government's got their back. And when we get back in, we absolutely need to change that vibe really, really quickly to get our economy motoring again.
Matthew, through the work at the Jobs Foundation, you're speaking to businesses all across the country, large and small. Is there anything that they all agree on that they think is the one measure?
If I had to pick one, I think it would be that businesses want a plan. And if you think back sort of 18 months to the early part of the general election, you had Labour launch their manifesto saying that they're going to put wealth creators at the centre of policy and saying that economic growth was going to be their number one mission for the government. And I think it's fair to say that just over a year into the government, they came in with no plan. And if you think about it, let's row back to the 70s, when Margaret Thatcher was involved with the Centre for Policy Studies, setting it up, coming up with a very concrete economic plan and thought-through plan for the country. Or even, sort of, dare I say, with Tony Blair coming in. He had a plan of basically matching Ken Clarke's spending plans, making the Bank of England independent. That was a plan of sorts, but it's really unusual for a government to come in with sort of zero plan whatsoever. So I think a plan would be good. And if I may give a plug for the book...
Of course. Since you have a copy.
Since I've got a copy already. I have a plan ready, written with myself and Arthur Laffer and Michael Hinsey at the front here and Douglas McWilliams, called Prosperity Through Growth, working out the principles, the policies and the politics of implementing a pro-growth plan, which will be out very soon. So you need a plan.
Yeah. And you have one to hand.
Yes.
Alice, City AM, the voice of the business, the voice of the city.
Yeah, so we are absolutely at City AM the voice of the Square Mile in the City of London, and I'm going to approach your question in three ways. What is things that that businesses want from government? So one is a policy ask, one is a kind of deeper cultural ask that we've been talking about, and one is something that they want to see from the Conservative Party. So the first thing that I think the city wants, I think the biggest policy ask from what I hear from people I talk to is to reduce stamp duty on shares. Britain is one of the only countries in the world that levies 0.5% on on sales of shares. It's a terrible tax. It's one of the main reasons why we've had this absolutely perilous collapse in IPOs. We're actually now less attractive as a destination to float your company than Mexico. That's a disaster. It gums up the market. It's the same with housing. If you're going to have to immediately upfront pay this huge tax, you're not going to sell stuff. So scrapping that would be a big win for the city. That's just a plain policy ask. Obviously, of course, no business is in favour of further tax rises on businesses. Very highly likely that we're going to see some more of these at the budget. That's also not something we want to see. But I think, as both of you have touched on, this deeper cultural thing about celebrating wealth and risk-taking. I think basically businesses want to feel that they have a government that likes them and appreciates them. And many of the signals that are being sent by this Labour government, wealth taxes, taxes on consumption of things that wealthy people like private schools, taxes on leaving your family business to your children when you die. That's just expropriating the dead. It's unfair, and it sends a strong message that Labour is not a party of business. So that is also a strong frustration that I hear from the city. And then I think what we want to hear from the Conservative Party, it's such a cliche to say, but the one thing that businesses want above all is stability. So what they want to see from the Conservative Party is a united party with a plan for change, a credible next government that will provide the stability, but also the platform for growth. So those are the three things I think businesses want to see.
Thank you very much. Andrew, from your decades of experience.
Yeah, thanks for emphasising that.
Sorry.
Much appreciated.
My bad.
Okay, so to add to the comments, I entirely agree with the rest of the panel. What I would say the one thing is to get capital mobilised. The risks that we've been talking about are expensive. There's risks inherent in the future. No amount of risk aversion and government regulation and protection can get rid of the risks that are inherent in the future. And to build a richer economy, to build a growing economy, takes a lot of capital. And I'm talking about private capital at risk, equity and debt, not government expenditure, private capital. Now, luckily, we have a lot of that. As in, the British public hold nearly £2 trillion, not in houses, not in pensions, just in liquid savings. But most of it's not being productively used. It's not being mobilized. People are fearful of putting it at risk, and people think the government and politicians do not like return on capital. So why would you risk it? There are millions of people with 10, 50, £100,000 in savings who should be much more involved in investing and growing businesses. It's a cultural change, but it's also a fear of government. That means, why would you put your money at risk when you think there's going to be a wealth tax? You think your income tax is going to go up. You think they won't like you being successful with it. Why would you put it at risk? More capital mobilized, that's what I think.
One of the things everyone has touched on is culture. We want a culture that celebrates business, and I think one of the things that the CPS is working on, a longer term project, is why America is so much more successful than the UK. And one of the things that keeps coming up, the sort of intangible things, is about culture. America is much better at celebrating the entrepreneurs, celebrating the success story. But that's conversely one of the hardest things to change, is the sort of British attitude towards success. How can we sort of adapt perhaps a more American attitude towards success?
Look, I mean, culture's not that hard to change, but it's really, really hard to change if you don't talk about it. And so the first thing you need to do, and I don't think we've talked about it really, I don't want to be disparaging, but I don't think we've talked about it for at least a generation, right? I mean, I think, you know, child of the 80s, I mean, you know, we talked about Tel Cid, you know, we had the privatisations. There was a sense, a bit more of the American sense of, look, if you work hard, if you aspire, maybe you set up a business, you can get on, and we support you in celebrating that. You know, there were a lot more named entrepreneurs around in those days. And so I think the first thing is you talk about it. The second thing is, obviously, you know, actions have consequences. And if you think about, you know, Charlie Munger, the sidekick of Warren Buffett, he said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. So if all of the incentives, to Andrew's points, are, you know, we're going to have more and more wealth taxes, we're going to try and find more and more devious ways of reducing your ISA allowances, consolidating down things that might encourage people to invest, driving through a culture in the financial regulators that say you can't really get access to advice. You know, we've effectively eliminated all but the independent financial advisor industry. So people aren't getting access to the advice and the knowledge and experience to do some of these things. I'm not suggesting anyone in this room puts their entire family fortune into crypto assets or stable coins. But again, you know, we took an entirely prohibitionary approach to that, you know, might have fired some people's curiosity or ambitions, or they'd seen an opportunity. We, to my eternal shame, were a government that attacked private landlords. Right? Private landlords is a form of putting capital to work to the good of society, providing people with a home, by and large a safe, secure home. You know, those things you can't ignore in this day and age. This sort of vibe that gets sent out, and if the vibe is, don't take risk, don't invest. If you do invest, you know, we're just waiting to come and, you know, throw some regulation your way or confiscate some of the fruits of that investment, then it is no surprise that we get what we've got today. The good news is, if we've done it to ourselves, and we by and large have, and if you look at the de-equitisation of the UK market, I think, you know, once upon a time it was about 40% private in individual, now it's about 6% or 6%, you know, asset allocation to UK equities. So we've done it all to ourselves. So if we've done it all to ourselves, you know, we don't need some, you know, shift in the universe. We can just reverse some of those policy measures and then go and do that again. But like all communication, and why we're probably all agreeing on culture, if you want to change culture, you've got to over-communicate. And we can do that now. We can start today.
When we set up the Jobs Foundation 2 years ago, we did a lot of market research to find out what people thought about the business community within the UK, and a number of things came out from it. The first one was that business is seen in a poorer light in the UK by quite a long way compared to other countries like the US and France and Germany. So you have work to do to actually extol the virtues of business and entrepreneurship. But secondly, we found out that what people liked and disliked about business, what they particularly liked about business, was the fact it creates jobs and provides training for people and pays tax. That's partly why we really emphasise, job creation, the provision of jobs and provision of training at the Jobs Foundation, because people really like businesses doing that. So I think one thing that the business community can really do is to talk about the jobs they're providing and crucially, the opportunity they're giving people through work to better their lives.
Well, that quite nicely brings me on to one of my questions, which was going to be how can businesses and government work together for things that are, as you say, one of the massive social goods businesses do is creating jobs. It's, an unabashed good for the economy and the individual. What do government and business need to do to work together to upskill, to create jobs, to help people back into work, especially who have perhaps been off work for a long time for various reasons? Do you want to?
Shall I go first? There are some very big things you need to do to make sure that the cost of employing people isn't too high, and that brings you into things like employers' NI and the living wage going up by a long way, the regulation around that, things like the Employment Rights Bill coming in. I would say there are some smaller things that could be done as well. So, for example, under the last government, a scheme was brought in to help veterans into work by giving employers a year-long break on employers' NI for any veteran they gave a job to. I think we should think about a similar scheme whereby we incentivise businesses to take on people who are currently out of work by saying no employers' NI. If you're currently on welfare and been brought into work, no employers' NI. So little incentives like that could go a long way to actually encouraging people to go back to work.
Alice?
So I want to go back to your point about culture, because I do think the climate of opinion matters here. And obviously at City AM, we are a newspaper that proudly celebrates wealth creators and the City of London. And one of the best things that everybody could do to encourage entrepreneurs in this country is read City AM every day. Download our app.
Yes.
Please do. But on the point about, look, if you want people to be celebrating wealth, we should be letting them keep more of it, right? So we should have lower taxes. And if we want to be getting people into work, we should have a system of incentives where you're not better off on sickness benefits than you are in work. Like, policy does matter here as well. So there are obvious fixes here.
Andrew?
I would add.
Sorry.
Andrew first.
There we go. It was a popular name for our age group. The education, I would say, is crucial to changing a lot of this. So the government has elements of what they call finance education, but there's nothing about investment in there. There is one centre at one of the universities, a Centre of Public Understanding of Finance, I think. Reading their website, it is so woke I could hardly bear to read it, unfortunately. And if I try to characterise what they were saying, Tom put his money into crypto and lost it all, do you think he was upset? Right? So there was nothing in there about a proper return on risk, nothing, right? The arithmetic wasn't even there. It is missing in the national curriculum, in business schools, in universities. Education, let's learn about this stuff.
And look, on employment, I mean, I agree with, obviously, the brilliant work that Matthew does in his foundation. There's a big piece, there's a cost piece, right? You've got to look at the relevant cost of employing somebody. If you want more of something, you don't put up the price. I think broadly literacy in this room will understand the basic economics of it. But there's also a risk piece. And I won't ask for an answer, it's a sort of more rhetorical question, but does anyone know how big the backlog in the Employment Tribunal is at the moment? There are 491,000 outstanding claims, right? If you employ somebody in the morning under the new Labour government's proposals on employment law, they will be able to go to an employment tribunal in the afternoon. Employers tell me that they're increasingly seeing applicants use AI to just generate a filed claim, so they don't even need to go through a process of seeking legal advice. That then joins the back of the queue. There are all sorts of perverse outcomes, even once you step aside from the contrived equal pay claims that many big employers and the public sector are seeing. There's been awards against a security guard who worked in London as a security guard, wanted to work from home in Cornwall. The Employment Tribunal found in his favour. Another employee who was compared to Darth Vader, the Employment Tribunal awarded about £60,000 for offence. There's all sorts of additional employment law offences. And the government's definitely going to make this worse. There's a 330-page, 120,000-word in unemployment rights bill that's going through Parliament right now, essentially written by the trade unions. I don't think trade unions are of themselves, a force for bad, but they are when they try and hijack the legislative agenda to really, really ramp up the risk of employing somebody. And so you've got a piece about what is the right level of cost. No one will ever quite fully agree on that, but clearly if you want more of it, you shouldn't jack up the price. But there's a really big thing about the risk of employing somebody. Just think that what it means to a small business. Right? It's sort of if you're a big business, you've got lawyers, you've got HR directors, but if you're a small business and like one of, say, a dozen employees takes you to the employment tribunal, that's for sure a £12,000 cost. Where is that coming from? It's coming from the wages of your other colleagues and at least a 2-year on cost when that process is being concluded. So there's a real piece about if you want more employment and it's an area where we're no longer competitive or flexible with other markets. That's just to try and add to what Matthew's already said.
I am going to throw open to audience questions in a couple of minutes, so start thinking. Sorry, my colleagues with microphones jumped into action immediately. I'm just giving you a warning that's coming. They were ready, so hopefully you will be with questions as well. Alice, a question, because one of the things that I think in the run-up to the election was quite notable was how many big businesses who would traditionally have probably felt much more comfortable with the Conservative Party did feel quite inclined, if not to support Labour, at least to give them a hearing. They probably don't feel like the first 18 months have gone particularly well. Are they ready to give up on Labour and come back to the Conservatives, or what more do the Conservatives need to do?
Sorry, I don't think they're ready to come back to the Conservatives. I think you're absolutely right that Labour did a good job of convincing the city of the importance of stability. And I think you're still seeing that now, but when there was a very strong bond market reaction, when there was a suggestion when Rachel Reeves was like weeping in Parliament that she might go, that there was a very negative reaction to that. And I think in the city they call this the moron premium, right? That she's like the best they have. And they would rather have her and Keir stable for the next 5 years than some, much madder left-wing person. But I don't think they're ready to come back to the Conservatives yet. They're certainly not convinced by reform. I mean, reform's economic agenda is all over the place. So I think that the Conservatives need to see this as an opportunity to start telling the better story. Because look, when you have debt as approaching 200% of GDP, you either need tax rises or spending cuts to calm the bond markets, and spending cuts are clearly the better option. And businesses will believe that if you can tell a convincing story about it.
I mean, Andrew, that's quite a challenge that Alice has laid down. Do you think the work is being done to regain that trust?
Yeah, I'm a bit more optimistic than Alice, but I'm the one having those day-to-day conversations with business, and understandably and probably quite healthfully. Most businesses don't spend most of their time engaging in public policy debates, particularly 4 years away from an election. So I think the number of businesses that would come out in support of this Labour government and its policies now would be measured on like 2 fingers of one hand. The only examples that the Labour government have given me, despite 9 months of asking, who support their employment law reforms, are the Co-op and IKEA, neither of whom are particularly UK orientated businesses. So I think there has been a very large reset, but this is process, and our job is to control what we can control. If you see us coming forward with credible plans, surfacing the tough choices that we're willing to make to balance the nation's finances, or at least improve the imbalance in the nation's finances, and then come forward with a pro-business agenda that shows we're listening, then that's the job of work. It's not by any means done. I'm looking forward to reading this book. pretty chunky, replete with good ideas amongst many others. And that's what we will do. But trust is earned, right? You don't just get it by just rocking up. You've got to be consistent. You've got to come up with sensible policies. And Alice is absolutely right about one thing, which is City AM does almost alone do a fantastic job of properly proselytising for London in particular, our capital markets and businesses. That'll get me another op-ed.
So does CapEx, to be clear.
Right, I'm going to throw out questions. I'm going to take 2 at a time, which I think is most helpful, and I'm going to also please request that they are short and definitely questions. So can we go with Alison and then Dan first? Sorry. There you go.
Thank you very much. So it used to be said that Britain, actually I'm going to say UK, and then I can include Northern Ireland in that. It used to be said that UK was an army of shopkeepers. So now we seem to have an army of people with side hustles, and these are the nascent entrepreneurs. Language is important, as the panel has already said, about how we refer to people in business. What can we do to celebrate these nascent entrepreneurs and encourage them to grow and be proud of what they do?
Brilliant question.
And then, sorry, other side down there. Right there.
Thank you. One of the decisions that Rishi Sunak took as Chancellor was to reduce the level of entrepreneurs relief for people starting businesses from 10 million down to 1 million. As someone who works in the tech sector, I'm sort of surrounded by startup entrepreneurs who really saw that as, as a bung for them as entrepreneurs, as a benefit for them taking the risk on starting a business. As part of the incentives that Andrew mentioned, do you think we should re-increase that level back to the original 10 million?
Well, if I,
Two goodies. Can I have a go?
we'll start with other Andrew and then you. Okay.
Go on then.
Sure. So on the side hustles, right, a lot of people, particularly those who are closer to it, say now is the best time ever to try starting your business. Yeah? And I honestly believe that. I work with large corporations mostly, but I do think celebrating what you're talking about, Alison, as a way of life, those 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years of people's careers, those years will come and go. I think the government and the opposition should be putting forward much more of a long-term vision where actually everyone could be running several careers, moving through things, being more flexible, right? That strikes, and it's much lower risk than it used to be. So I think you're spot on there. On the reliefs, right, I'm not going to say I would quite understand how that would all flow through. To get capital in behind, right, does strike me as you need a broader reduction in taxes, right? And I think the number of entrepreneur startups that I know who do it on their own, i.e. without third-party capital, is quite small. You're not bootstrapping. So I would have thought a broader reduction in business taxes would be more helpful.
The number of side hustles and the sort of entrepreneurial nature of young people in particular give us all great hope for the future. I'm properly impressed, and it drives my optimism about the future. It's so hard at the moment to transform a side hustle, and you see them, every craft market. If you go online, look at Instagram, lots and lots of people have got these side hustles. It's really hard. All of the things that you need to do in business, what are the things that business, all of them, have in common as they try and scale? Well, they start to interact with the taxman, and that is not a friendly process. It's overly complex and very, very unempathetic to somebody who's starting out, who's trying to navigate the tax code in their own time. You need to get a bank account. It's ruinously difficult to get a bank account. We've created and this is the consequence of financial regulation. It's not the banks. They are told by the regulator to treat you as a criminal until proven otherwise. And that has to stop, and that will stop, and that was one of the announcements on policy we made today. So that's knocking down two of the barriers. Employment law, we've talked about the difficulty, and there's a whole point about actually access to physical premises. But those are the basic building blocks that almost every business, as it goes from being a side hustle to a main hustle or a business, has to go through. And I'm very, very focused on identifying all of those frictions and trying to mitigate those where we can. Entrepreneurs Relief, I was a fan of Entrepreneurs Relief. I'm glad it's still there at $1 million. There'll always be a debate about what the right level is, but these incentives do matter. You have to calibrate them in the right way and work out which ones have the best. And certainly any of these taxes carry a big weight in terms of the signal they send. So if you've got relief for people who are doing the right thing, or if you've got penalties for people who aren't. The final thing I'll just say on that is, again, today we have committed to relook again at IR35. So IR35 gave people a lot of autonomy about their own life, their own affairs, and now is the time to look at whether we can reform that. If we're interested in having more people who are self-employed, that's often a pathway to a business, then we need to find the right way to reform that.
Is there anything else?
We open up the book actually talking about how incentives matter. And that's actually literally the first line of the book, talking about that. And they really do for entrepreneurship. And there's been lots of talk, of course, about how high net worth individuals are sort of moving overseas to perhaps Portugal and Dubai and elsewhere. But as worryingly, if not more so, other younger entrepreneurs who are just setting up in business now. And we need those people to be setting up their businesses here in the UK, which will grow into the sort of unicorns perhaps of the future. So that's really important.
Yes.
Right. Okay. The lady at the back.
I'd just like,
Sorry, can you just wait for the mic?
Thank you.
yes, Isabella Moore. I'd just like the panel's view on this idea of cutting corporation tax to 12.5% for the first million and then 20% thereafter.
Lovely. And then the chap at the front. Sorry, I'm making my colleague run about. Apologies.
Jeremy Maddox, I'm chairman of the largest Conservative branch in the country.
Well done.
Thank you. I would just like to ask a quick question about the employment tribunals, because I think it was the Conservatives who got rid of the fee, which might have led to part of the increase. But my main point is I think it's fantastic that IR35 is going to be looked at, because in the tech industry, which you and I worked in, this has been such a scourge for the industry. But doing some other big, bold things, for example, capital gains tax brings in somewhere between 13 and 19 billion. It's not a huge amount of tax, but it makes a massive impact on businesses and their ability to invest. And I'm just wondering, something big and bold, like removing IR35 or getting rid of capital gains tax, would send an incredible and fantastic message to the business community.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Andrew, do you want to start?
Look, directionally, I agree with all of those sentiments. I mean, I wouldn't be such a fan as I am of the CPS and Andrew's previous work at the Taxpayers Alliance if I didn't think that getting the right tax incentives and lowering the burden matters. And you saw the first down payment, if you like, on that, which is has to start with spending choices. Right? I'm done at my stage of life with any politician talking about, reducing red tape and cutting taxes without saying how. Because every manifesto says that, and you've actually got to rehearse the tough choices. That's one of the reasons why I was a fan of Kemi, because even in government, I'd seen her willing to make those trade-offs. So I won't be enticed to sort of comment on any individual level, but I've said it before that incentives really do matter. As a society, we generally overtax things like, capital, overtax property because the taxman finds that easy, and sometimes we don't tax. Flip side of that is relative to other markets, we don't tax consumption to the same degree. So, that's a longer debate that we shouldn't have here. But this is about how you get people working again. Then clearly taxes on growing businesses and taxes on employment are the areas that one wants to look to try and reduce or mitigate wherever you can.
If I could just, I like the sound of massively reducing corporation tax, but that's not actually what I hear from the city in terms of what makes Britain competitive or uncompetitive, because obviously we have Ireland right next door, which has a much lower corporation tax and has attracted some of our business, but not all of it. It's not so much a question of headline rates, it's a question of how you can sort of like fiddle your taxes in other ways with things like, so you might get the super deduction there to lower your headline rate. And I think actually really what businesses might prefer is just a much simpler tax system, right? A headline rate that they can understand. So big businesses are great at this. They can choose their jurisdiction based on where they can offset their taxes in other ways. But surely you would be the most attractive jurisdiction in the world if you're just like, this is simple. You pay X amount, and maybe it could be around 25%. That's not an unattractive headline rate of corporation tax, but it's simple and it's understandable. And that's what really businesses tell me they're more interested in seeing than overall reduction in corporation tax. Mm-hmm.
Yep, you saved it at the last there. So just simple, yes, but lowish rates.
Yes,
it's got to be,
low,
because the high rates is what distorts things. So on the point about capital gains, I would have thought indexation is important in there, and to keep it lower than income tax. Why? Because it represents risk, right? Labour ought to and will get paid whether the business succeeds or not, and can pay one income tax. Capital gains, you only get the gain if it works. So it should be a lower rate, I think, and it should be indexed as well, in my view. And your point about a low entry rate, do you remember Gordon Brown had a 0 rate for a while for corporation tax, didn't he? Right? Yep, good old Gordon Brown, right? So smaller businesses just earn your way into it, absolutely. Yeah, so progressive rates, as long as the top end is not too high.
Yeah. I didn't answer the question about employment tribunal fee. I mean, that's one access to pull, but ultimately, it's too easy to roll the dice, in my view. It's too easy to roll the dice and get a big payout from the employment tribunal. So long as that continues to be the case, whether you charge a fee of £55 or not, it's fairly moot. The issue is it's too easy. The courts are too keen to award those payouts. It's a little bit like a microcosm of what you read about on immigration tribunals. It's been captured by the employment law brigade.
Right. Trying to make sure my colleagues don't need to run around, but I've lost them. So can we take the two from the front? Is that okay? And then I will come to this side of the room. Sorry, apologies.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Corinne Turnbull and I'm speaking on behalf of the Better Bones campaign. I was interested in the mobilisation of capital. Wanted to ask a question about human capital. I'm not sure if you're aware, but there are, I think it's 1 million sick days are taken every year due to fractures in the older workforce. Obviously, that's a very experienced workforce. We want them to be in employment, guiding the juniors of the future. And there is a huge cost attached to that for business as well, around 130 to 142 million pounds each year. We would be very keen to know if the Shadow Secretary of State for Business and Trade could support and encourage the Health Secretary to provide universal fracture liaison services across this country in order to keep people in work, in order to reduce the cost on business, support the growth that those older workers can provide.
Thank you. And then further along the same row, I think there was another question.
Hi, I'm Nick. I run a construction products business, and I completely concur with Andrew's point. So I recently managed to get over the hurdle of setting up a community interest company bank account, and some really ridiculous questions. But actually, it's a bit more fundamental than that. It's all to do with risk towards corporate lending. So I believe after the 2008 financial crash, the reforms didn't quite come down with the right balance towards attitudes on corporate lending. Although it's not very sexy, actually, when I set up my first business bank account back in 2012, what was really nice was I had a business bank account manager who came round, knocked on the door and said, Nick, what you're trying to do with your business, let me try and really understand your business, try and understand your profile, what you're trying to do. And then, with the reforms that happened and cost cutting, that was all sort of taken away. So it's a more fundamental cultural shift in lending, opening that side up that can support the businesses, so they can really understand what they're trying to do and really kind of open that up.
Yeah. I'll try both of those. Better Bones sounds good. We'll maybe talk afterwards, and I can talk about to the Shadow Health Secretary. There's a really important point. I hope Matthew talks about this because he's done such good work generally about how we continue to make careers work throughout people's lives. And you think about the rate at which the state pension entitlement kicks in. At some point, we're all going to be working for longer. Maybe that means different ways of working. But certainly, you've got a huge resource there. And we should think about, don't want to be too accountant about it, but we should think about the people in our society, the pool of labour, as a resource, both for them and for us. On the banking piece, the banks, it's easy to make banks the villain of the piece. I don't think that's fair. I think they are very, very highly regulated entities. And behind it, their ability to lend depends very heavily on the weighting that the financial regulators put behind things like small and medium-sized enterprise loan books. There's been a big issue about debanking of all sorts of different industries that haven't curried favour with particular governments or sectors of the day. But really what you need to do is to significantly deregulate the banking environment so that they can lend greater multiples of their own balance sheets, and that would put a lot more business in the economy. I won't pick on the bank, but someone told me a few days ago that one of our big high street lenders used to have a commercial loan book to businesses such as yourselves, are about 120 billion. It's now 70 billion, not necessarily because they can't find the opportunities, there's no dearth of opportunities, but simply because of the financial regulators that sit behind them, that you won't always see, they don't have offices on the high street, have changed the ratings on their own balance sheet. That was a post-2008 intervention, and that pendulum, I've said very, very publicly for a long time, went far too far towards the risk-averse direction. It was in the process of being fixed by Chancellor Hunt and myself and others, but that job has not been done to the same degree. The US is now about to massively deregulate bank lending in the US, and that's going to be another competitive advantage that we have to compete against.
Did you want to come in on supporting older workers or other?
Sure. I should talk about the work we've done at the Jobs Foundation about getting people into work and work throughout lives. And it's a new report we did in September called Ladders of Opportunity, which looked at the different cohorts of workers, including younger workers struggling to get into the workforce, long-term sick, areas of deprivation, some targeted groups like ex-offenders, but also older workers as well. And this touched on sort of different matters like that. And I think, of course, now with the workplace, it is easier to work in a more flexible way. I think sometimes that's been overused in certain areas. So I was talking to, I won't name the regulator, I had a meeting with them just before this. I was asking them about their work from home policies. And they were saying their employees are still allowed to work from home 4 days a week. And I was saying, well, you know that sort of Jamie Dimon, if you talk to him, he's got all his employees back in the office. So I think there is a place for work from home and more flexible working, and that should be looked at. And we look at things in the round at JF in terms of making sure that as many people as possible can work.
I mean, I do think if we want to talk about older workers, we do have to talk about pensions as well. I mean, this kind of touches on everything, like the future risks to the economy, to our fiscal sustainability, the fact that, you know, the triple lock is just completely unsustainable, and if we need to reduce welfare spending, we need to be looking as much at pensions, I think, as we do at welfare for working age people. I don't know. That's
Looking
a difficult one for you.
Andrew there, as if a response is coming.
I mean, look, I think you've got a very, very large denominator to go through with welfare generally, right? It's a very, very large number. The biggest, I think the big cause to action should be those of working age. Because you think about it, if you're of working age, you've got more degrees of freedom to change your circumstances.
But does working age end at 67?
Well, I mean, I hope not. I mean, I'm going to hopefully keep working beyond 67. I don't think we should have, you know, bright lines in any domain. But look, on the point, there's a very large amount that the state is spending, continues to spend more and more on welfare generally. So look, by all means, look within that, you know, with Geely stimulate eyes. But you know, also look at where, you know, you've got a tragedy at the other end of 1 million young people, you know, who've never had a job or virtually never had a job. You know, let's try and move them from, it sounds terrible, but the sort of the liability side to the asset side of the ledger by getting them into work. You know, look, by all means, you know, forensically at the entirety of where the state spends its money. But there's a crisis, if you like, an overused word, but it's a crisis right in front of us right now that could add to the top-line growth of our economy, could improve people's mental health, could solve the challenge that many employers face of scarcity of people. Let's deal with that one. You know, people talk about the triple lock. I think that's about to solve itself, because if you look at the rate of increase in wages, that's plummeting as the government is effectively driving any marginal additional jobs out of the economy, so wage growth is slowing. And the issue we've got at the moment, which is if you want the double lock, which is keeping pensions in pace with inflation. Well, inflation is nudging on 4%, and the Bank of England thinks it may yet go higher. So that's what's actually carrying the heavy lifting at the moment on the cost of pensions. It's the indexation. And I'm not sure I'd want to default too quickly into a world where we didn't keep the purchasing price parity of people's pensions going in line with the economy. What would you do if you were in government? I think, one, fix that issue or try and do everything you can about those young people that haven't got the opportunity to work at the moment. And secondly, deal with inflation, which is a crisis right in front of us right now. It's not in some OBR scorecard for the future. That is here and now. The cost of living is going up at a very significant rate.
I will say, if you're interested in the welfare trap, I'll let the applause come first. If you are interested in the welfare trap and worklessness, we have a panel called Escaping the Welfare Trap here tomorrow at 3 o'clock with Andrew's colleague Helen Waitley, Fraser Nelson, Jimmy McLaughlin and Therese Coffey, which I'm sure will cover all of these issues and more. Right, any more questions? We will take the chap at the front and then two behind. Thank you.
we've heard a lot about the economics and the culture issues about worklessness, but there's also a social impact, which is that people's life chances has a multiplier effect, because then those people's children have much worse life chances. So I'm a big supporter of what Matthew's setting out in Jobs Foundation about giving a holiday to national insurance for people taking on the first job. And I would urge future Conservative government to also embrace that, because it will have a much more social and economic impact as well. So I'd like to hear from Andrew about that.
And then 2 rows back. Yeah.
Thank you, panel. So my question is to bring it back to entrepreneurial growth in the youth, because that's what we need to kickstart, is how are you as the shadow opposition actually holding the current government to account to inculcate that in our youth? Because I think that's somewhere we can really win and make gains.
Actually, shall we take 3? Is there another question? There we go.
Hi, Joe Hackett, Mineral Products Association. We're a trade body for concrete, cement, quarries, etc. I've got a question about regulators. Dealing with regulators is a big barrier for many of our members. Earlier this year, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer called all the regulators in and told them, facilitate growth, focus on facilitating growth. On the ground, we haven't seen any change like that. How can we make it less of a nightmare for businesses across all industries to interact with regulators and comply with the regulation that's there?
Matthew, do you want to start?
I think it's worth looking quite big picture at all of this, as you're implying. If you look at the whole worklessness issue, often people sort of focus very much on small but significant things like cutting employers' NI to get people into work, or we've also talked about a skills tax credit and things like that. We need to make sure as well that we're creating all the jobs needed. So currently, to get employment back to 80%, which is where it was roughly pre-COVID, you need to get over 2 million people into work. But there are only about sort of 750,000 job vacancies at the moment. So how are we going to create those extra 1.25 million jobs to actually make sure that all the jobs that are needed? And that's where the growth side comes in. So getting the economy growing and businesses thriving, creating those jobs and the training is really crucial. And of course, once you get growth going as well, you're then not fighting so much over a set pie. And so issues like pensions, of course, start solving themselves. So really the message is we need to get the economy growing to get more prosperity.
Andrew, did you want to touch on regulators specifically, perhaps?
Well, the gentleman's question about how do we hold the government to account to help entrepreneurs. Look, it's hard. I mean, the government needs to listen to be held to account, but there are good data sets out there about new entrepreneurs, new companies being formed. Sadly, there are far fewer of those being formed now, and it's our job to use our voices both in and outside of Parliament to try and proselytise for these things. The more we come up with policies, I'm a patriot. I want our country to succeed. And so if we come up with policies to make life better, to help entrepreneurs, and the government lifts them way before we get back into power, fantastic. If the government, as I desperately hope they do, takes some measures to reverse the brain drain. That pains me. I mean, I see no political advantage in the fact that the best and brightest people are some of the best and brightest are leaving our country. That's terrible. So we will come up with our own policy prescriptions, and if the government lifts those, fantastic. If not, it will need our government to implement them, and we will call them out where we think that they're not delivering on what they say themselves.
Particularly for the youth, so
Yeah.
The young ones.
Correct.
They are the entrepreneurs of tomorrow.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. I don't know if you're an entrepreneur, but if you are, thank you for fantastic. Thank you very much for doing that.
I'm Colin, and I'm a trustee at Startup Croydon.
Right.
And they help businesses start up. And they've had 40 years of experience.
That's great.
Brilliant, fantastic. And the other question was about regulators. Look, at the end of the day, you just need fewer regulators and fewer people in them. And so the job of work, I won't shoot entirely from the hip here today, but we will need to go through, and we are going through the list, saying that this regulator either isn't needed at all, or this one needs fewer resources. By and large, if you look at the growth of regulatory headcount, it's just expanded very significantly. Very few regulators actually solve the problems that they're set up to solve. They just find new ones on top, and that justifies an ever-increasing headcount, and that has a huge cost. It would be nice to have some sort of OBR star mechanism that annually calibrated the entire deadweight cost of regulation on society so that we could have a proper literate debate about that. But in the absence of that, a good proxy is simply fewer heads. You know, when I was a finance director and I found we were spending too much on marketing, you could go through line by line of every newspaper advert, or you could say essentially I need fewer people in the marketing department, and then each of them will not be spending as much because they don't have their own individual budgets. We have to do that chainsaw exercise on regulators because to improve growth, we need to improve the clock speed of the UK economy. We're not a bad economy. We're diverse, we're creative, we've got all these wonderful entrepreneurs, but time, speed to market, being slow is the big thing that holds us back, and therefore less grit in the oyster, less sand in the machine, fewer regulators, cut some of them back.
I do think there's a literacy point here, because I think you said you worked in quarries. Isn't there some mad new quarry tax?
Yeah.
But I only know about this because we published an op-ed about it in City Air, because I was like, I've not heard of this tax. That sounds mental. We need to be shining a light on this. And I do think part of it is, when it's holding the government to account when it's doing things that are clearly mental, like a tax on quarries. So, I guess that's just a transparency and accountability.
There's a long-standing tax on quarries. They just want to make it 10 times worse.
It sounds bonkers. So, I guess that's the climate of opinion piece there that I want to fly a flag for.
Just briefly on the regulators, I remember when Sir Keir did this round table that you talked about, right? And someone said to me, so regulating for growth sounds a bit like democratic socialism. So a contradiction in terms, right? You can't regulate for growth, right? A few dozen, few hundred, maybe a few thousand, too many people. They don't have all the mundane knowledge, as Tom Sowell would call it, that the millions of people out there do have. You need access to that knowledge to have growth. So my suggestion on this would be, in many cases, a moratorium on any changes or new rules at all until the economy is really humming. And then when it's a humming, we're rich enough to say, now we have the luxury to try and raise some standards in some places. But we're not rich enough to do that at the moment, would be my view. Slow down, stop, let everybody catch up.
We've got time for maybe one or two more questions, if there are any remaining in the audience. Can we take the hand right at the back, if that's possible? Hang on, yeah.
Yeah, hi there, I'm Jack. Today we've heard a lot about worklessness being a big issue, and whether that's welfare state, whether that's the lost boys, and all the other social issues that creates. Looking further ahead, we talk a lot about AI. Now, AI to me is looking like it's going to take a lot of the jobs that we're hoping to create. How does the panel feel that gap can be closed?
It seems like a good question to end on if you want to address AI.
Well, I'll launch in briefly. So I see AI very closely in my consulting career, and personally, I think it is going to leverage up a lot of jobs. Right? There are elements of entry-level jobs, legal, accounting, etc., right, which are potentially going to be automated away, but people will still need to hire juniors to grow into the mediums, to grow into the seniors, right? And I think I see AI as leveraging up, right, much more.
Yeah, I agree. I think AI is quite scary and new, but I think every technological revolution ends up creating more jobs than it destroys. So I think you just have to lean into it and try and be positive about it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, essentially it will end up being like digital, the internet, electricity in its time. It'll be a productivity tool. I'm not worried about that. I'd be really worried if politicians used it as another excuse to try and intervene, pick winners, get involved in making economic determinations. Where I think the government does have a role is making sure that we are an AI-ready society. Whether that's the public sector instrumenting its data sets so that you can fully exploit AI, whether it's making sure that the UK population in its widest sense has access to AI tools. Some countries around the world are just buying country-level licenses so that everybody from a school pupil upwards has access to the latest LLMs at no incremental cost. That feels to me the sort of productive infrastructure that even a small state Thatcherite conservative as myself thinks there is a role for government in that, but it should be making us AI ready. There will be some change and some creative destruction that goes on, but the right way to do that is slightly to embrace it and make sure we can exploit the opportunities. And there are legion of opportunities in AI, not necessarily in just the infrastructure layer or these LLMs, but what's called agentic AI, the AI applications, whether it's helping us discover new knowledge or whether it's trying to write new forms of medical therapeutics that will help us live longer. So there's a lot of opportunities for us in that.
I agree with that. We also need to be thinking about the careers of the future. And I've got two young daughters, aged 8 and 5. And I was looking at some jobs books with them recently about their careers they could be thinking about. And what's interesting is they talk about careers which are already going out. So actually when you think about careers in schools and jobs in schools, think about those jobs in the future which will be affected by AI.
I have one last question for Matthew. When does the book come out?
The book comes out on the 23rd of October.
There you go, and Andrew's going to hold it up for you now.
Distinguished company, look at that. There you go.
I did my bit.
Before... Getting at least a free signed
Of
copy.
course.
Yeah,
Come
fully
on.
signed.
Come on, everybody. Right. Very illustrious.
Thank you.
Before I thank the panel, I would just say the next event in this space is From the Ground Up, putting SMEs at the heart of conservative renewal. We will be joined by Matthew's colleague Georgiana, Tim Dyer, Jimmy McLaughlin, Danielle Dunfield-Preo, who is the chair of Conservatives for Business, who is supporting that panel, and Tina McKenzie from the Federation of Small Businesses. There will also be wine available, if I can tempt you into staying for that event as well. But if you can join me all for thanking the Jobs Foundation for supporting this panel and the panellists.
Thank you.